So, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to some of you. Welcome to the Vision G webinar series, launched in 2014 by the AERA Graduate Student Executive Committee. These former podcasts, now webinars, highlight scholarship, discuss contemporary issues, and hopefully start conversations among the Vision G members and the greater educational community. Also, be sure to join our Facebook group, AERA, the Vision G students, social context of education. For an archive of last year's webinars, please visit our AERA Division G YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook. Our group is called the AERA Division G Students Social Context of Education, as well as follow us on Twitter, which is at AERA Div G. Thank you for joining us. We're happy to be your host today. My name is Carolina Silva, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Washington State University.
And my name is Jeremiah Satsaraka, and I'm also a fourth-year PhD student here at Washington State University. So we are excited to welcome Dr. Rene Holt from Washington State University, Dr. Kaiwipuni Lipe from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and Dr. Luis Urrieta from the University of Texas at Austin, for a conversation on history, education, and indigeneity. So we're going to begin by asking our guests a few questions and then open it up to questions from our audience. If you have a question, please type it in the Zoom chat box. So you just got to click on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen to open it up.
Okay, so first I'd like to welcome each of our participating scholars. Would you please introduce yourself by telling us who you are and what brought you to this work? We can start with you, Dr. Lipe.
Okay, good morning. My name is Kaiwipuni Lipe. I grew up on the island of Oahu, primarily in the moku of Ewa, Kona, Ko'olaupoko, and Ko'olauloa. But my mother's side of the family originally comes from Hana, Maui, and my father's family originally comes from India, from Kerala, India. In Hawaii, it's really important to kind of give a little bit of genealogy about who I am. And really, I'm just the convergence of many genealogies. So just for a second, the granddaughter of Catherine Leilani Lee, who only had an 8th grade education, but probably was the best entrepreneur in our house, in our family. I'm the daughter of Dr. Lilikala Kame'elehiva and Dr. James Michael Anthony, both first-generation students who earned their PhDs. So I am not a first-generation college student, and there's a lot of privilege that comes with that, for sure. I'm a former Hawaiian language immersion student. I'm a Olapa of Hula, and some of my mentors include Chancellor Maynette Benham and Professor Miguel Guajardo. I'm also a wife to Daniel Lipe, who's Western Band Cherokee, and together we have 2 children, our daughter Haena, who's 10, and our son Lamaku, who's 6. And basically those genealogies all brought me to the work I do today. But if I have to pick a moment in time, and there are many, but one that stands out for me for sure was when, as a young mother, I brought my daughter, my infant daughter, to work to the university where I'm at now. And I was basically rejected for doing that. And that was in a university that claims that we're trying to strive towards being inclusive of the concept of ohana, which is family. And it really sparked a flame for me about helping to indigenize our institution, that, words on a page are not enough. And I was kind of living that experience. And so I quit my job, basically went back to grad school to really research how do we transform institutions into Indigenous places of learning, particularly for us, a Hawaiian place of learning. So that was my beginning.
Well, first of all, Nachusco, Hialinga Luis Urrieta Ramos, ka Noctepo Anapuchka. My name is Luis Urrieta Ramos, and I come from the community of San Miguel, Noctepo. But I was not born there. Actually, I was born in Los Angeles, California. My parents are both migrants, undocumented migrants from the state of Michoacan in Mexico. And I was born and raised in LA, but I was always raised knowing that my family came from this particular community. And as I was growing up, I was very much immersed in the community, because whenever we had social gatherings, parties, whatever, it usually was the same people from the same town that met up. And so I grew up knowing a lot of my extended family as family. And for a long time, we couldn't visit Mexico because my parents were undocumented. But once we were able to visit, then we used to visit almost every summer. So I went back and my dad always made it a point to tell my uncles to take us out to the field, where they would grow the corn and, where they had the animals and stuff like that. And so they really wanted us to know the place in an intimate way. And I think that really instilled in me this very strong sense of who I was. Even though in college, I focused a lot on work around Chicanos and Chicanas, and a lot of my earlier work that I did research in focused on Chicanas and Chicanos. Eventually I started doing research again in Mexico by following kids from my home community, where my family is from, on return visits to the annual Quinchua, which is the annual festivities of the patron saint. And so then it sort of rekindled, an interest in this work. And it just really is something that, just started growing more and more. I did a Fulbright in Michoacan in 2009, 2010 for a year. And I went back to live in the community. It's a very small community. There's about 900 people there. And back then it still didn't have internet or anything like that. So it was pretty much experiencing life the way it was then. It's changed a lot in the last, 8 to 10 years. But that's been, pretty powerful for me, I think. Just going back to my roots, right? Shirangwa, and just getting closer, learning a little bit more of the language, and really trying to instill that in my kids. And my partner, my compañera, she is from the same town where my dad is from as well. So I think a lot of us that grew up surrounded by the same people from our home community also, married people from the same community. So yeah, I'm pretty immersed in this. So I think we all reflect a little bit of who we are in our own work.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, that was really, I enjoyed hearing both colleagues here introduce themselves, and it reminded me about who we are as Indigenous people. And I just want to say thank you, Katsiao Yao and Hiaha. My English name is Rene Holt, but my Indian name is Lipe. And as a little girl, my grandmother gave me a name of a Sabi name. And those are the names that I carry within myself. But I am Dine and also Mimipu. I work here at Washington State University, and I currently work in the Department of Teaching and Learning within the Clearinghouse on Native Teaching and Learning here at WSU. And one of the things that I really find why I'm here in this work is the representation or the lack of representation of Indigenous Native teachers. And yeah, I also just want to echo what the two have shared earlier. And it looks like you can't hear me. So I'll speak up a little bit louder, but I am just a year out from completing my doctoral program here in the Cultural Studies and Social Thought program. A student of Dr. Paula Groves Price, who is here also, but working in Native education. I started out I was born in LA, and actually really the question about indigeneity speaks to me because although I was born in an urban area, LA is like home, and but it's a city home. But I also was raised on the reservation in Denebekea, and that's actually where my cultural teaching started. And education was really a key part to my family value system. And my grandparents didn't speak English, and they knew that English was the way to help ourselves. And so, you know, celebrating my other culture as Nimipu, you know, I'm here because, again, going back to representation, but I am also a mother. I have aunties and grandmothers, nieces and nephews, grandparents that would never be able to come through the system the way I had. And I think going through a doctoral program really is a privilege. And so I appreciate who has come through and also who's going through it right now. And I think that's part of my work, is being able to support and help and uplift those who get into a system that doesn't necessarily represent us, nor was it created for us. And so that's kind of how I view my work and how I've come here.
All right, thank you. So Louise, we can start with you. But how do we define Indigenous peoples and or indigeneity?
Well, I think first of all, you know, it's a complex issue, right? I think it varies from place to place. Some people associate indigeneity with native language, being able to speak a native language. Some people associate it with cultural practices, you know, specific rituals or ceremonies. Some people associate it with knowing or having access to some of the ancestral knowledge or wisdom of a community. So it's complex. It varies. You know, some people really ascribe, you know, value to some of those things. But sometimes some of those aspects are valued because of the national context in which people are in, or the local communities where people are in. For example, if you look at Mexican history, initially there were a lot of racialist associations, you know, associated with indigeneity. But after the independence from Spain, a lot of those racialist views were challenged. And starting in 1930, they started to associate indigeneity officially with language, native language abilities. And so if you spoke an indigenous language, you were counted as an indigenous person in the census. But if you didn't speak the indigenous language, then you were not considered indigenous. For some people, you know, as long as you live in the pueblo, as long as you live in the community, you're considered indigenous. But once people leave, they're no longer thought of as indigenous because now they've left the pueblo or the community, right? But those are all challenged, right? None of these are static. You know, for some people, indigeneity is connected to just the knowledge of everyday living, right? How you relate to others, right? Your ties to the community, knowing your responsibilities and commitments to the community, the service that we owe to communities, and also just having some of that, you know, ancestral memory of where you come from in your own identity, right? And how you relate to others, people, nature, living and non-living things, right? So that's kind of how I view indigeneity. Just, you know, it's about communality, it's about relationality, and also about commitments to other native peoples and other places, right? Trying to form alliances and understanding amongst other indigenous people.
I want to build off of what Luis was talking about a little bit. I think I'm going to speak specifically about being at home in Hawaii. And to also start by saying it's a little uncomfortable to try and define how other people define themselves. So I want to talk a little bit about what kind of the struggle and the movement has been at home in Hawaii. I think for us, I think for all of us, there's so much healing that needs to go on around this topic. Whether we are, we can still identify ourselves as Indigenous or not, if we've lost those connections somehow or another. One of my great mentors, Nalani Minton, at home in Hawaii talks about, we all need healing, indigenous and non-indigenous, colonized and colonizer. And so I wanna start with the kind of frame it that way. For us at home, we are able to identify ourselves as indigenous to Hawaii because our stories connect us to our familial genealogy with our place. And so for us, our Earth Mother is really our ancestral grandmother. And our ability to connect that way through genealogy is critical. And we are recovering at home the ways and the practices to understand our connections, to understand our genealogies. We're going to talk a little bit later about education and what role that's played in colonization, but for sure that's a part of how we are able or not able to remember our connections with our place. But I think it's a really important piece, at least for us at home, and for all the Indigenous peoples I met around the world. Luis talked a little bit about it, our connection, our community with our natural world as well. For us, our natural world is born first. So our earth, our sky, our sun, our clouds, our rain, our water, and all the things that grow from it are ancestors in Hawaii. So I would never say that when I am in Oregon or in New Mexico or in Texas or anywhere else in the world, that is my Earth Mother and that I am indigenous to that place. In Hawaii, I know my ancestral roots that connect me to that place, that connect me in a familial way. And that's really important in the way I've been taught. And I say that, but also want to honor that in a sense, we're very privileged in Hawaii, that for the most part, many of us know and can remember some of our connections to place. But we have not been forcibly removed from our place. And I say that with kind of a caveat that how expensive it is to live in Hawaii, many feel forced to leave our home now. But especially with my experience being married to a Cherokee whose some of his family survived the Trail of Tears with that forcible removal, that connection to place gets changed over time. And I know many others who are indigenous, they know they're indigenous, but that they have been, that connection to their place has been severed by colonization. And I want to honor that that's a struggle and that they continue to look for their connections back to their indigenous roots. So I'll stop there and we can continue.
Thank you for sharing that. You both have shared very deep and meaningful understandings of what indigeneity is, and I echo them. But to further that and to really, I think, enhance what it means for myself, I went through a period of my life where I actually did struggle with my own identity. And because I come from two nations, one was always considered more than the other. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I've learned since then is that balance is really essential and crucial to who I am and how I work as an educator. Because I had, an elder who's no longer here, who's passed on, once share, when I was an undergrad, college co-ed, I had no children, wasn't married, and so I was still exploring and trying to figure out what it is that I wanted. And she shared, whatever it is that you decide to do, you really need to know who you are. You need to know who you are in order to help others. And at the time, I had this idea that I was going to go on to law school. I was pre-law, majoring and having a real focus in political science and history, and really thinking about as I look back, I had been indoctrinated about what I think of education without even realizing or knowing it. And when that elder shared that with me, we were at a powwow, and of course, powwow, is one part of one side of my culture and heritage, but on the other side, it's not. And so being told you can't do that, or that's not a right you had to earn, I was born into it. And so to have this complex of you can and cannot do this was a constant struggle. And so since then, of course, I've gone and done a 360, and I didn't go pre-law. I actually had no idea or plans that I would even pursue a doctoral education. Indigeneity, or being indigenous, for me means coming from the land. My grandparents, I was fortunate to have them in my early formative years and up into my early 20s. And my grandparents, again, they didn't speak English. And so I had to learn how to translate at times for them or be an interpreter, and I didn't like it. I was feeling this pressure that I didn't want to know my language, or I wanted to be, again, this educated native, and that's a real systemic issue. And it goes to erasure, that they want us all to be the same. And so as I look back now, I'm very proud of my roots, and I'm very proud that I could speak and understand, and was fortunate to have my grandparents teach me that value. And I also thank that elder who's no longer here, and she's passed along since, you know, it's been a while. But those are the types of teachings that I carry with myself, and they come from the land. There's no place, there's no story, and they're not things that you can find in a book. And, you know, we were trained critically to research and also, you know, be critical of the institution and the academics that we go through. But there is something there deeper that cannot be brought into the academy, and that's our cultural understandings of who we are. And to me, that's what indigeneity is. And, you know, I've heard friends and, you know, colleagues talk about, you know, indigenizing the academy, and they're doing great work. And I find it problematic at times because it doesn't represent who we are as Indigenous people. We're so vast and diverse throughout the country and the world, actually, that to put us into one subject area, it's a really large, I think it's a beast that's bigger than we even understand at times, because we're in such research foci. We're in very specific areas and pockets of whatever research we choose to go into. And I think indigeneity is something that the academy can't touch sometimes. And it's beautiful. It's something very powerful. It is empowering, and sometimes that's what's threatening. Right? And we have senior scholars who've been doing this research for a while that we look up to as scholars of color, and, you know, we don't hear them as often. We don't hear about them until, you know, we're like in our 5th or 6th year of program, because our other faculty or non-faculty of color aren't aware of them. And sometimes I question that, you know, and I realize that those are the types of things that come from home, right? It's word of mouth, it's community, it's relationality. I found the scholars that I did who are Indigenous because of another scholar and another friend and a friend of a friend, not because it was something that was handed to me as a reading list from my program. And that was, you know, a learning curve for me. And I look back, hindsight, you know, 5 years ago, who I was. I'm not that person today, but I think indigeneity is really large, and it's not capable of being put into one space because there's so many of us that speak. I mean, we have 566 tribal nations in the United States in the colonial borders, not even including the First Nations of Canada or the tribal communities south in Mexico, and then going further to Central America and then into South America. You know, we're such a vast network of people that it's celebration. It's something to celebrate, but it's also work that we have to find space in. So I don't know. I hope that helps. It's such a it's a mystery at times to me. Because I've had people ask, how do you define it? And I think, in echoing what you just heard, is that it's more than these contextual labels that we put on there, because there's such deep language and deep meaning within that aren't conveyed so easily. And it's not meant to. That's where the relationality piece comes in, where we have to talk. And I think I have some Kanaka people, some like Namaka Rawlings, and Walter Kahumoko and Dr. Teresa Makuhani, they talk about story, like we talk story, and to hear them say, this is how we talk story or we do things, and I think that's such a beautiful piece of heart talk. And learning about Manulani Meyer, it really put into perspective that not everybody sees the world the same way. If Kanaka people see their beginning from the ocean, that the ocean is where their life begins, that's so conceptual for me because part of my family heritage is from a desert. And so water is so precious and sacred that we just wish for it sometimes and pray for it. Yet there's an abundance in your homelands, right? And so the beauty behind that is what I think we are trying to, we navigate into this space that doesn't understand what that means, right? It's too conceptual for that. And so, yeah, I think that's how I would define. Thank you. So the next question has more to do with education, which some of you have touched on. So how is schooling implicated in colonization? What are and have been the colonizing effects of schooling? And any of you can take it away at this point. Well, I'll share. So I want to share, I'll skip a little bit because we were asked what were we reading. And I really, I couldn't find my book this morning, so I think I loaned it out. But Lipe Patel just wrote Decolonizing Educational Research, and she built that. She built from that in her dissertation research, countering coloniality in educational research from ownership to answerability. She has a little section on that, and it's taken me a long time to accept and understand how deeply I had been colonized. That was really difficult for me because, there's this movement of decolonization, right? Indigenous people decolonizing. And I was fervently in agreement with it and wanted to pursue and just really immerse myself in that. But I didn't understand how I had been colonized at that point. And when I started unlayering it, I realized the very concept and notion of education that we have been taught since birth is colonial. Mm-hmm. And that took a while for me to get through. Again, I was thinking I'm going into pre-law, I wanted to do law, and my idea of working in DC, all of these crazy ideas that I look back now and think I would never do that now, and it's because I understand the education as we know it is a Western system, and that doesn't mean we can't have other systems, because we do. As Indigenous people, we have our own forms and methodologies of teaching and learning, and that took a while for me to understand. It took a while. Like I've come around now, thankfully, but Lipe Patel just really put it into perspective. And if you haven't found her work yet, I highly recommend it. It's really it's anti-colonial, from research to understanding and knowing what settler colonialism is. There was a time in my program where I didn't know what settler colonialism was. And then when it was put into context and actually, reading articles about it, I learned, I was a part of the colonial project. And that was quite humbling, and then I became angry. Then I wanted to fight the system. Then I wanted to fight everybody, and now I'm like at peace, wanting to garden and just chill out and read books and, watch my children enjoy life too. But education is a Western system, the way we teach and talk about it. And so I just defer to my colleagues and would like to hear how they think about it, because I'm still struggling with it. I'm trying to, I'm working within a system, and I've got 10 students that I'm working through a Native Teacher Prep project, and we deconstruct their work. We have an Indigenous education seminar, and I basically just ask them, bring your syllabi, what are you reading, and then we deconstruct it from Indigenous perspectives, and that's the best that we can do right now without going into the unresolved historical griefs and trauma which are perpetuated in education, right? We are erased. And that's what settler colonialism is really about, is the erasure of Indigenous people. So, yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I think schooling is fundamentally part of the colonial project, right? It's part of the setup, you know, to rein people in and have them go through this system where, you know, the schooling aspect, the curriculum tries to expunge, you know, the other knowledges that we come to school with, to devalue them, to make them non-knowledges, to other these knowledges, and make them non-existent, right? To erase them, and in the process, we experience schooling in very painful ways. Just even from our own names, you know, and how our names are erased, or mispronounced or chopped up or whatever, to how we learn about ourselves in the Western curriculum, right? As savages, as, you know, non-civilized, human sacrificing, you know, just all these things, right? That then we internalize, and then become, you know, oppression and oppressive to our own selves, right? Where we are ashamed, right? We learn some of that shame in the process. At the same time that we're trying to counter the narratives, right? Or that our family members, our community counters the narratives, we're struggling with them, right? And for me, you know, that was particularly difficult because, you know, I was born in the U.S., right? But I had all these stories and narratives of where my family, where my people were from, and so. And also the you know, these expectations, right? For example, the language expectation that because I wasn't fluent in the native language, or I couldn't speak the native language, then I couldn't truly be, you know, Purepecha, right? I had to be something else, and to try to sort through that, because school was telling me one thing, right? The colonial context of the U.S. is telling me another thing. The colonial legacy of Latin America, of the Spanish, is telling me another thing. And so teasing through these multiple colonialities, right? In the ways that they're presented to us at school is very difficult. And not just the curriculum, but the ways that schools teach you to relate to others, right? In very individualistic, very, you know, they teach you to value certain things, right? What it means to be successful, what it means to be successful economically, what it means to be successful in school. And then, you know, as we internalize those, how we buy into some of those narratives that directly counter the communality, right? The relationality that we're being taught to value at home and through community life, right? So that's it's an ongoing process. I mean, that is colonialism, the structure in effect, right? The structure of settler colonialism in effect, the ways that we are put through the schooling system. And I see it even with my own kids, right? The way that they struggle with the ways that, you know, schooling is expecting them to be and what to value, right? And I don't tell them like, oh, you know, you have to like school, or you have to, you know, it's almost have to have the talk like, you know, looking back, I hated school.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, your experience of hating school is valid. Now, how are we going to navigate through it, right? How are we going to navigate through it? How are we going to challenge the structures that are there? Because I cannot not send you, you know? And that's been true even in the past, right? When Native people did not send their kids to school, you know, they were imprisoned. The kids were rounded up. They were taken away. And I've seen that even in documents of my own community. When I visited the archives in Mexico, you know, in the late 1920s, 1930s, how they would threaten the parents, you know, that if they didn't send their kids to school, that they were going to be fined, that they were going to be imprisoned, you know, and that's been a way of resisting, right? But it's fundamentally colonialist. I mean, there's no other way, right? Now, how do we challenge that? That's part, I think, of what we're all trying to deal with, right? I'm going to stop there because I can go on.
I'll add a few comments. I'll tell a quick story about my family in Hawaii. So my grandmother, that I mentioned in the beginning, Catherine Elani Lee, was born in 1920. And so in 1898 comes the illegal annexation of Hawaii to America. And during that time, all languages, and this story is parallel to the stories around the world, of course. All languages other than English are banned from the school system. And so my grandma grows up in a time where she does not learn to speak her language. Of course, her mother, with love, forbids her to learn Hawaiian. Grows up in a time where she only went to 8th grade. She had to go and become a maid in a military house, which is a whole nother kind of craziness. And, you know, eventually sends my mom to a private school, a Hawaiian private school, but that is a school for Hawaiians, not necessarily a Hawaiian knowledge-based school. And my mom grows up in a colonial, you know, education system, again, with lots of Hawaiians all being colonized together very quickly, ironically enough. And all that time, again, a law actually forbidding Hawaiian language to be taught in the schools, well, forbidding all other languages really, other than English. And so I was born in 1983, and it just happens to be the same year that a group of Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian scholars, just a handful of them, got together and said, oh my goodness, what are we gonna do? Our Hawaiian language is on the brink of extinction. Again, a story that we hear around the world. And I'm really just lucky enough that I was born at the right time. Maybe it was divine intervention that by the time I was ready for preschool, I could go to a Hawaiian language immersion preschool. And that's something that my brother, that's 7.5 years older than me, didn't have the same privilege, right? Totally sets me in a different trajectory. And so I ended up going to a Hawaiian immersion preschool and elementary school in a colonial context in a sense, but using our own power of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous language to decolonize in some ways, some forms and fashion. And that has really saved, through education, through this mainstream kind of colonial system, has really saved our language. We're not out of danger, but we are in much less danger than we were. But I will say that today, so I have 2 little kids, and the struggle of that colonial education system in which Hawaiian language immersion, for example, and Hawaiian charter schools now exist, it's a huge struggle. I mean, when we think about NCLB and all the things that have really further shaped some of the empowering projects that are in our communities, it's really, really tough. And so we actually kept our kids home for a while. We pulled them out of school and we homeschooled. And that, of course, is such a place of privilege that we were able to do that. It is not the typical of what someone in our community can do, because everybody has to go to work. You know, we moved home, you know, with family to be able to make this all work. But I share this story because I want to honor that schooling has been a huge, if maybe not the biggest factor of colonization in our communities, but it's also, at least in our hometown in Hawaii, even in the face of the struggle of the constant, you know, DOE system, we have been using it, and I want to honor those that have really been at the forefront of using it to re-empower ourselves, to reconnect ourselves through language and culture. But it's this ongoing struggle because it's not a perfect system. And in Hawaii, many of us are arguing we need our own education system. We want to divorce ourselves from the mainstream system and create our own system, and we think we have the resource and intelligence to do that. And that's honestly where I want to go for my children. So I'll stop there.
But while we're waiting for questions, I do have one. So we've heard comments about losing connections to our Indigenous communities, kind of the generational trauma, the hurt, being part of the colonial project through schools and education. And Puni, you touched on this a little bit about, you know, the role that schools and education can play in healing communities. But I wanted to pose the question, can schools and education provide places of healing, or should we be looking to other places to find that source of healing?
I'll jump in and say absolutely. In our communities, schools have been places of healing, but we can't. And in addition, I would say cultural practice. So the different cultural practices that exist in all of our home communities are just as critical, if not more. I don't think it's an either or. It's multiple spaces of healing. It's multiple spaces of healing over time. right? I think that my mentors have really helped me see that we don't all have the same process. We're not all as children going to grow up and have this fantastic, like for me, I think of my beautiful Hawaiian bubble as a child in Hawaiian immersion, and that real space of healing for me and my family, really. But that's not going to be the same for all folks. And we all have different trajectories of when we can find spaces of healing and open ourselves up to it. For me, hula as my cultural practice is critical as part of my healing process. But absolutely, they have to be. We have to make them. But we also have to be critical about how I think that we cannot become relaxed and just accept, what's the status quo of what we've created. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep questioning ourselves. I think the work, and this is not my particular work yet, I hope it will be in the future, but we talk about teacher preparation. And I think we have to continue to ask ourselves, and both my colleagues spoke to this, is really fighting against and questioning what is education and what does it look like? Because we have so many generations of seeing it from a different perspective other than our own Indigenous communities. We really, I think, have to interrogate ourselves constantly with love. But from a place of really trying to move forward is for us, what does Hawaiian education really look like, right? Is it what's become accepted over the past 2 or 3 generations? Why has it become accepted? Why is that what we think, and to continue to question, I think, is really important as we look more and more for ways to heal. Because again, the way we've been colonized is so deep within ourselves that just because we stand, and I'll say this for myself, just because I stand as a Hawaiian woman and do things, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the Hawaiian way. And I have to continue to grow myself and with a community around me. So I'll stop there.
I want to thank you, Puni, for countering the narrative that all schooling is oppressive, because I think you bring up a really great point. And I want to make a distinction between, I kept saying schooling, and I was referring specifically to schooling. I kind of see schooling and education as different things.
Yeah.
They may overlap, they may become one, but they're not necessarily the same. And I know that in a lot of Latino communities, and some people claim that the concept of educación comes from an indigenous sort of mindset, is not the same thing as being schooled, right? Going to school and learning your lessons and passing your classes and getting your grades, right? It's more about learning a way of being, right? Learning a way of relating to others, learning a way of engaging others in respectful ways. And one of the things that I studied when I was in my community in Mexico was how kids learned outside of school, how they learned in the family and community context. And a lot of it was by being with others, by observing, by being present, by helping out. And, a lot of kids develop this notion or this idea of, helping out without being asked, right? Of learning cooperation, responsibility, coordinating in space, with others in responsible ways, and how to respect elders, how to listen to the stories that people were sharing. And a lot of those things are not necessarily the things we learn in school. But if we can take some of those things, right, and develop, schooling around these ways of relating to each other, right? And I don't want to call it indigenizing, because I don't know, if we can say that we can indigenize an institution that was not meant to be indigenized, but that we can maybe create spaces, right, where these become the basis of engagement, where these become the ways that we do things, right? The ways of knowing, the ways of being, the ways of doing in these spaces. And we have examples of some of that, in Maori communities and in other communities, maybe like the ones that you're sharing with us from Hawaii and other places in the world, right? I would like to say that maybe even the ethnic studies program in Tucson was an example of this as well, right? I ran an after-school program that we called Cultura en Acción, right? That was also based on this model of, you know, indigenous knowledge generated from the students themselves and the families that were involved in this project, and it was very healing and it was very transformative. But I think that it's, you know, we need to tease through and tease out, you know, a lot of what is institutional, what is schooling, what is education or educación, what is community knowledge, what are the community ways of knowing and being and doing that can become part of an educational space, right? That is healing and transformative, that is regenerational and rejuvenating to all of us, right? Because in these spaces, we're all learning from each other. We can learn from a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that. I just want to, there's two things that I really want to point before we, our time's getting close. I think bell hooks, number one, teaching to transgress really comes to me right now. And she was one who really reached into my understanding as a teacher educator, working with non-Native students at the time, and now working just specifically with Native students. We have a Native teacher education project. And to answer the question, I really want to distinguish that for Indigenous people here in the US who are members of federally recognized tribes, one of the things that some of us who still have language are struggling with right now is the fact that public schools are erasing language, our first languages. And so I'm a really big proponent and, you know, champion of language immersion nests. So there are focused specifically on the Indigenous language of the said students. So in my case, I have 3 tribal communities and then 2 other tribal nations that aren't from the plateau, interior Columbia Plateau. And each of them, each of these 5 communities, they're working towards language preservation, language revitalization in a couple of other communities. And the only way that I see that this could be helpful is to establish their own tribal standards in education. Because right now the public schools are held by state standards. And that's really, that's a real struggle for tribal communities who are trying to revitalize their language. And so my students are language immersion teachers, but they aren't state certified teachers. And so the state is saying you can't be, you know, a teacher until you're state certified, yet these are individuals who have been immersion for 5 years that speak proficiently in their language, yet they're not viewed as teachers. And so we are working with a state education, the State Standards Board, on creating an alternative route to the teacher cert that honors Indigenous language and honors who they are in their home communities. And that has been really, it's been a challenge because we're also educating state educators in the process. And to answer that question, it's not as easy as it sounds. It's extra work on top of what we are currently doing. And so I think it's good. The Maori were the first to introduce language immersion, and I think the Kanaka Maoris or Kanakas have after that. And then now we had the Blackfeet here in the US, and then Lakota. You know, these are tribal communities that have rather significant populations of language speakers that were able to create immersion nests. And now we have other tribal communities on that same journey and path. And it's not an easy one because the education system, again, a Western concept, a Western foundation, is about assimilation. And in that, you know, settler colonialism, you know, is about the ownership of land. And Indigenous people are in the way of that progress, are in the way of that land ownership. And so the erasure also goes into public schools curriculum.
And so it's kind of hard for me at times. I vacillate where I'm really against it and yet I'm in it, right? I'm working in it. And so my thought is to help these students get through and stay and remain within their community. And that's where I find a little more peace in knowing that I'm not perpetuating a system that really, again, to visit what we talked about earlier, is that it wasn't meant for us. It really wasn't. If you look at how and when universities are established, they usually were started in the late 1700s or early 1800s, and all you have to look at is the history of the country at that time. It was by rich white people, right? And slavery was in full effect at that time. And so Indigenous and Black and non-white people were not factors that they included in any of the educational process. And so historically, we're still unlayering all of that. And that's part of what teaching and learning is for me today. And I find myself, again, constantly thinking about how to help my students who are language immersionist teachers, and just making sure that they get through that state standard system, because I believe in their work as well. I believe, I have students who are 10 years my junior that are proficient speakers of their language, and I look at them as elder knowledge keepers, right? That's really something that I deem high versus a senior scholar who's like 20 plus years, mile-long list of publications, and then here's this one person that can't get state cert. I struggle with that, the value system of it. It hurts at times because I believe in this work so much, but to answer and share, that's kind of how I see it's a yes and yet no at the same time.
Okay, thank you so much, Renee. So we have a question from our audience, from Gabriela Kovac Sanchez, and it's specifically directed to Luis. So her question is, she appreciates the comments about not necessarily indigenizing a colonial institution that wasn't meant to be indigenous. In the first place, along those same lines, do you think decolonizing means indigenizing? And more importantly, in our decolonial efforts, how do we uphold the reaffirmation rather than the appropriation of indigeneity, particularly for those of us who are, right, mestizo, Chicanos, under the Latinx umbrella, who lost our direct connection to our indigenous roots?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I think a lot of times people equate decolonizing with indigenizing, but I think it's a little bit different. I kind of see decolonizing as more of a challenge to the colonialist practices of an institution, and trying to not just challenge them, but trying to dismantle them or change them. Whereas indigenizing tends to be thought of as, implementing some of the indigenous practices or indigenous knowledge into the institutional structure, with the ultimate goal of changing some of that structure. But I think either one is complex. I mean, the institutions are resilient, and they, the structures within the institutions are made and remade in response to the challenges that they face, the challenges that they face to the setup, right? It's the idea of like upholding, reaffirming culture and appropriating indigeneity. That one's a tough one too. I mean, I think, if we go back to some of the work of Guillermo Bonfil Batalla in Mexico Profundo, where he argues that, the inner soul of Mexico, or Mexicans, or Latinx, if you want to take that term, is an indigenous soul, right? That is denied, to this notion of modernity being, European, not indigenous. Then as mestizos, Ladinos, Chicanos, I think what's important is to look at what's there, right? what are the practices that we still have in communities? What is the indigenous knowledge that remains in our ways of knowing and being? Because I think a lot of times in the quest to, find roots or to, become more connected to indigeneity, people do, appropriate, right? The cultural practices of indigenous communities. And we see that through, the appropriation of, dances, clothing, notions like, the trueque, right? The exchange, cargos, the words are escaping me. That then people bring together and try to put them together into sort of this reformed indigeneity, right? And I think that there is danger in doing that, because there are communities, who have these cultural practices, whose knowledge is again being taken and being appropriated, right? And we've written a little bit about this with Maylee Blackwell and with Floridalma Boch Lopez. We just published a special issue of Latino Studies titled Critical Latinx Indigeneities, where we talk about, how do indigenous migrants experience, their indigeneity or live their indigeneity within the context of migration, both in relation to other Latinos, mestizos, Chicanos, with regard to cultural appropriation, but also in relation to U.S. native tribal peoples, right? Because we are also guests on their lands, right? And following the work of Asian settler colonial scholars, do we run the risk of also enacting settler colonial processes by our own presence, right? Especially by upholding the myth that, this is a land of immigrants, right? And that we are just part of another wave of people that's coming to make, their lives and live their dreams at the expense of Native people, right? By erasing U.S. tribal people. And so that's what I mean, that's why I mean that it's complex, right? Because it's not just one layer, it's all these different layers at once, right? So I'm all for people discovering and building and nurturing their Native, stories, their indigenous histories. I'm talking about mestizos, Latinos, Chicanos, but also not taking and appropriating, the cultural practices of contemporary living, indigenous people that are, their community knowledges, their language, their systems of social systems of interacting and engaging, right?
So before we wrap up, just wanted to ask Puni if you had any last words.
Yeah, sure. I'll add just one teeny tiny thing. I really appreciate the work that you folks are doing. This is awesome work, and thank you to my colleagues for having me on this panel. I think with regards to kind of the conversation that's going on, I think one thing I would add, at least in Hawaii, this is what we are arguing at the moment, might change. And I think that's important to honor, that as we decolonize and indigenize ourselves, that our realities and our truths will transform as well. But for us, I think we are committed to indigenizing our universities in one way or another, because it is on our land. And I think that's a really important point, that, every university in Hawaii and America is on somebody's indigenous land, on somebody's earth mother, in real ways. And it reaps the resources. So I want to talk about Hawaii. Our universities reap the resources of our ancestors every single day. And so we didn't get a chance to talk about what the role of non-indigenous folks are, but we really have to help uplift that truth and to really interrogate what that means. That we are reaping the resources of living things that are our ancestors every single day, and that we have to help ourselves and our non-indigenous allies think about what that means. And I think every community has its own lens for really thinking about what that means and talking through it. I think in Hawaii, we certainly do. And that's the work I'm committed to. If nothing else, and this is a really low bar, but really helping people remember where they are in the world when they're in Hawaii. And that to be there and to be able to drink of Hawaii's waters and breathe her air and eat her foods means that you're in relationship. And what does that mean in terms of your reciprocity? So I'll stop there and just say thank you very much for including me.
Wow, thank you everyone, especially to our participating scholars, Dr. Holt, Dr. Lipe, and Dr. Urrieta, and to all of you for engaging with us in this conversation. We're featuring 3 publications from each of our participant scholars on our Division G graduate student community blog today, so we can post a little link in the chat box. We encourage you to visit that place if you'd like to read more about their work, to inform your research and praxis. We also want to invite you to continue examining these questions with us on Twitter using the hashtag DivGChat and following us at AERA DivG. Finally, our Division G graduate student members you should also look for an email from us so that you can complete the annual survey. I think we've included a link as well in the chat box. It shouldn't take any more than 10 minutes, so please do it so that we can get feedback. And if you have any ideas on future workshops and topics for these webinars, let us know as well. We look forward to your ideas and insights. Thank you so much, everyone, especially our scholars. I learned a lot. So.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day, everyone.
It was really nice to meet you all, those I haven't met, and thank you for sharing the space, the virtual space.